Was Richard II truly a king, or a magnificent, tragic puppet? Did those 28 years of peace with France actually signify anything, or were they just a shimmering mirage in a sea of ambition and blood? Let's dive into the whirlwind life of Richard, a ruler who seemed to be building a glorious empire, only to find himself tumbling into a dark, desperate corner of history. The story begins, oddly enough, with a tomb. Not a grand, celebratory monument, but a rather gloomy affair designed for Richard and his beloved Anne. It was 1396, and Richard, still reeling from the merciless Parliament, a brutal political purge that had nearly ended his reign, was pouring his fortune into this elaborate resting place. It wasn't ordered until the following year, a bizarre delay fueled by the king's desire to use the magnificent stone elsewhere. But the sheer scale of the funeral arrangements, the staggering sums spent on the double tomb, spoke volumes about the depth of his grief. It was a grief so profound, so consuming, that it seemed to echo through the very stones of Westminster Abbey. Then came the infamous brawl at the funeral of the Earl of Arundel. A chaotic scene of spilled blood, a delayed service, and a frantic cleansing of the abbey. Richard, in his fury, had physically attacked the Earl, a man who had dared to arrive late and depart early, an act deemed utterly contemptible by the king. It wasn't just a personal insult, it was a challenge to Richard's authority, a blatant disregard for the solemnity of the occasion. And conveniently, there was a debt hanging over the Earl, a hefty £40,000, a sum that wouldn't be lightly dismissed. A chest containing papal bulls and marriage documents alongside that damning obligation was quietly moved to Westminster Abbey for safekeeping, a silent reminder of the simmering tension. But Richard wasn't just preoccupied with funerals and feuds. He had his sights set on Ireland, a land that had been a thorn in the side of English rulers for decades. In 1385, he appointed Robert de Vere as Marquess of Dublin, a bold move to reassert English control. A year later, the title of Duke of Ireland was bestowed upon him, a clear signal of Richard's intentions. The aftermath of the merciless Parliament and Richard's subsequent return to power saw the appointment of the Earl of Gloucester as King's Lieutenant, a position that was swiftly cancelled in favor of the young Earl of March, Roger Mortimer. Mortimer, a mere 19 years old, was a complicated figure. He was still a minor, with 2 years before he'd even set foot in Ireland. And when he did, it was alongside the king, a precarious pairing for a young nobleman entrusted with such a significant responsibility. Richard assembled a force of no fewer than 7,000 men, a truly impressive army for the time, and landed at Waterford in October 1394. His initial goal was swift and decisive: to subdue Art Mac Murrough, a self-proclaimed king of Leinster, a persistent Irish chieftain who had been harassing English interests. After a grueling 3-month campaign, Mac Murrough finally submitted to the king's peace, effectively ending his rebellion. The situation didn't end there. The head of the O'Neill clan, a powerful Irish chieftain, performed homage and fealty to Richard in person at Drogheda, followed by other chieftains eager to pledge their allegiance. By early 1395, Richard had seemingly restored English lordship throughout the areas once under its control. It was a remarkable achievement, a testament to his military prowess and strategic vision. Returning to England in May, he'd not only bolstered his reputation as a warrior but had also secured settlements with the Irish chieftains, offering a glimpse into his ambitions for the island. But this triumph in Ireland was merely a prelude to a renewed focus on France. For decades, England and France had been locked in a bitter struggle for dominance. Richard, however, seemed to be seeking a different kind of peace, one that extended beyond the battlefield. He began to adopt the language of majesty, a style of address rarely used in England, echoing the traditions of French kingship. It was as if he was consciously crafting an image of himself as a powerful, almost imperial ruler. Consider this: Richard corresponded with the Count of Holland, describing how the appellants had rebelled against the royal will, leaving to him little but the royal name. His response: an eternal peace, a chilling declaration of absolute authority. This vision of royal peace, a lengthy truce of 28 years, was formalized with a diplomatic marriage between Richard II and the 7-year-old Isabella, daughter of Charles VI of France, the first Anglo-French royal marriage in nearly a century. It was a calculated move, a strategic alliance designed to secure peace and stability. The truce, however, wasn't without its complexities. It allowed both England and France to maintain honor and reap practical benefits, sacrificing almost nothing in the process. The agreement was solidified during a series of personal meetings between Richard and Charles VI at Ardres near Calais. But the king's ambitions extended beyond mere diplomacy. He envisioned a broader peace, a crusade against the Ottoman Turks, a revival of Christian unity. Contemporary evidence, indirect but compelling, supported this vision. Sir John Clanvow, Richard's chamber knight, spoke of the justice of crusading warfare in contrast to the evil of internecine fighting. Philippe de Mézières, Richard's envoy, urged an Anglo-French crusade, advocating for a joint expedition against the Turks. Even Richard's uncles, John of Gaunt and Edmund of York, and his cousin, the Earl of Rutland, embraced this crusading vision, sponsoring the little-known Order of the Passion. A presentation copy of de Mézières de la Chevalerie de la Passion de Jésus-Christ was made for Richard, a tangible symbol of his commitment to this grand design. The culmination of this peace policy arrived at Ardres, where Richard and Charles VI formally presented Isabella to the English king. The wedding, held in the Church of St. Nicholas in Calais, was a lavish affair, a carefully orchestrated display of royal power and diplomatic success. 3 days later, Richard and Isabella sailed for England, enjoying a remarkably smooth journey. On 23 November, the Queen made a ceremonial entry into London, followed by her coronation on 5 January, a grand celebration marked by a fortnight of tournaments and entertainments. But the dream of a united Christian Europe began to unravel with the devastating defeat of the Crusaders at Nicopolis in September 1396. The death or capture of a significant portion of European chivalry shattered the crusading movement, exposing the fragility of Richard's ambitions. In the wake of this disaster, Richard turned his attention to France once more, seeking funds to support a planned expedition against Milan. The January Parliament of 1397 at Westminster started with Bishop Stafford of Exeter praising the state of the kingdom, but the Commons were less enthusiastic about funding a French campaign. They begrudgingly agreed to provide the money, but only as a private undertaking of the king, refusing to acknowledge its importance. The situation escalated further with the submission of a set of grievances from the Commons, complaining about the qualifications of sheriffs, the state of the Scottish marches, the abuse of badges of livery, and the excessive cost of the royal household. Richard responded to the first three with a conciliatory tone, but vehemently rejected the fourth, which challenged his prerogative. The unfortunate clerk Thomas Haxey was brought before the king and sentenced as a traitor, a harsh punishment that underscored Richard's determination to maintain control. Meanwhile, Richard was pursuing a Plantagenet dream that stretched back to the reign of Henry III, the desire to obtain the imperial crown. In the spring of 1397, the Archdeacon of Cologne visited England, and an English delegation was sent to Cologne in July bearing costly gifts for the Archbishops of Cologne and Trier, as well as the Dukes of Bavaria and Saxony, the imperial electors. Richard's agents had received the homage of Rupert of Bavaria, Count Palatine of the Rhine, in May, and in return, the Archbishop of Cologne performed homage to Richard on 7 July. Payment was made to another imperial elector, the Count of Gelders, on 10 July. This apparent diplomatic success emboldened Richard to take a drastic step. On the same day that payment was made to the Count of Gelders, the Earl of Warwick was arrested after dining with the king and taken to the Tower. At the same time, Archbishop Arundel was persuaded to surrender himself and was dispatched to Calais. Richard sent letters to the sheriffs announcing the arrests, attributing them to the actions of the new appellants, the same individuals who had challenged his authority in 1387 to 1388. Walsingham, a key advisor to Richard, offered a compelling explanation, suggesting that Richard was motivated by a desire to demonstrate his control over his lords, rather than by personal revenge. The conspirators were tried in Parliament. The Earl of Arundel was convicted and sentenced to death, but spared drawing and quartering. The Earl of Warwick begged for mercy and was spared, stripped of his lands and exiled to the Isle of Man. The Earl of Gloucester, however, was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death, although his corpse was returned to England and given a burial in Bermondsey Priory, a stark contrast to the royal status he deserved. Archbishop Arundel, granted 6 weeks to flee the realm, departed London on 13 October, the feast day of St. Edward the Confessor, a poignant reminder of Richard's connection to the Plantagenet dynasty. As 1396 drew to a close, Richard seemed to stand at the head of a united Christian Europe, armed with a 28-year truce with France, a substantial dowry, and the appearance of restored relations with his magnates. He was poised to pursue his dreams, but those dreams were soon to be shattered. The vision of a triumphant crusade, a cornerstone of Richard's ambitions, was abruptly extinguished by the devastating defeat at Nicopolis. Was Richard II truly a king, or a magnificent, tragic puppet? Did those 28 years of peace with France actually signify anything, or were they just a shimmering mirage in a sea of ambition and blood?